At 20 minutes past 11 on the morning of December 18, 1944, the destroyer USS Hull lay over on her starboard side in the Philippine Sea, and she did not come back up. Nothing had hit her. No torpedo, no bomb, no shell. The sea simply came over her rail and kept coming, and the ship stayed on her side with her stacks in the water, and green water began pouring down into the boiler rooms. Men who had been standing on a steel deck a minute earlier were now standing on a steel wall. Some of them walked out along the hull the way you would walk along a fallen tree, and stepped off into a sea that was blowing so hard the surface had gone white and flat, and the spray had turned the air into something you could drown in standing up. Of the men aboard Hull that morning, 62 were pulled out of the water alive. She was not the only one. Within the same few hours, 2 more American destroyers went over in the same storm. The Monaghan capsized with only a handful of survivors. The Spence went down with almost her entire crew. In a single morning, in a fleet that never fired a shot at an enemy, close to 800 American sailors died. And the inquiry that followed did not lay it all on the weather. The officers who sat on that court asked a stranger question than you would expect. They asked how the ships had been loaded. They asked how much fuel was in the tanks, and what had been added to the decks over 3 years of war, and whether anyone had pumped seawater into the empty spaces low in the hull. They were asking, in the plain language of a naval inquiry, about the ordinary daily business of keeping 300 men fed, washed and asleep at sea. Because on a destroyer, those two things were never separate. The arrangement that let a crew live inside that hull was the same arrangement that decided whether the hull came back upright. And once you understand how those men actually lived, where they slept, when they ate, what the ship gave them and what it took first for itself, the loss of 3 destroyers in a typhoon stops looking like an accident of weather. It starts looking like arithmetic. Start with sleep, because that is where most of them died. A wartime destroyer was a little under 400 feet long and about 40 feet across at her widest point. Most of that length belonged to machinery, boilers, turbines, reduction gears, shafts. The middle of the ship was an engine, and the engine got the best of everything, because a destroyer that could not run was not a destroyer at all. What was left over for the crew was pushed to the ends, forward in the bow, and aft over the propellers. So the men slept in compartments below the waterline at the 2 points where the ship moved most violently. In a heavy sea, the bow of a destroyer does not rise and fall so much as fall and stop. Men in the forward berthing spaces learnt to sleep braced, one arm hooked through the frame of the rack, because the drop at the end of a wave would lift a sleeping man off the canvas and set him down again a moment later. The racks themselves were pipe frames with a sheet of canvas laced across them, and they were stacked 3 and 4 high, with something under 2 feet of clearance between one man's face and the underside of the bunk above him. There was no privacy of any kind. There was a locker roughly the size of a suitcase. Men slept in their clothes, because you could be called to your battle station in under a minute and there would be no time to dress. And many of them slept with a kapok life jacket folded under their heads, which served as a pillow and meant the thing was already in your hands if the compartment started filling. And here is the part that is easy to say quickly and worth slowing down for. Those berthing compartments were placed directly above and alongside the magazines and the fuel tanks. There was nowhere else to put them. The ship's ammunition had to be low and central to the guns, and the fuel had to be low for stability, and the crew had to fit around them. So the men slept on top of the ammunition. For a year, 2 years, 3 years, several hundred Americans lay down every night on a thin sheet of canvas above several tons of powder and shells and fuel oil, and went to sleep. Not that they slept much. The watch system on a destroyer in a combat zone was 4 hours on and 4 hours off, which sounds survivable until you work it through. 4 hours off does not mean 4 hours of sleep. It means 4 hours to get from your station to your compartment, eat if there is food, wash if there is water, and lie down, and then be woken with enough time to be back on station. In practice, a man got perhaps 2 or 3 hours at a stretch. Then add general quarters, dawn and dusk were the dangerous hours, so the whole crew went to battle stations at first light, and again at last light, every single day, whether or not there was an enemy within 500 miles, add a contact on the radar, a submarine report, an unidentified aircraft, and the alarm went again. There were destroyer crews in the Pacific who went weeks without a single uninterrupted night. Eating was worse, and it was worse for a reason nobody thinks about. The galley on a destroyer was small, a compartment you could cross in a few strides, feeding a crew that ran to 300 men and more as the war added radar operators and anti-aircraft gunners. To a ship designed for fewer, there was no dining room. Men queued down a passageway with a metal tray, took what there was, and ate in the mess compartment, which in the same 24 hours also served as the letter-writing room, the card room, the movie theatre, and the place where the wounded were laid out. In heavy weather, the cooks could not cook at all. You cannot keep a pot on a range in a ship rolling 40 degrees, so the food became sandwiches and coffee, handed out cold, and men ate standing up, wedged into a corner with one foot braced against a stanchion. And then there was fresh water, which is where the ship's real priorities showed. A destroyer made her own fresh water in evaporators, boiling seawater, and condensing the steam. It was never enough, and the water that was made did not go to the crew first, it went to the boilers. Because salt in a boiler means scale, and scale means a burst tube, and a burst tube in the middle of an engagement could leave the ship dead in the water in front of an enemy. The machinery drank first, the men got what was left. When the evaporators fell behind, and they often did, water hours were cut, showers stopped, laundry stopped. Men washed in salt water with a grey soap that never quite lathered and never quite rinsed, and wore the same uniform for a week or longer in tropical heat, in compartments with no air conditioning, packed 4 bunks deep. Now put all of that back into the Typhoon. The destroyer burned fuel at an enormous rate. She was, in effect, a set of engines with a thin steel skin wrapped around them, and a destroyer running low on fuel became a dangerous thing, because the empty tanks low in the hull had been part of what held her upright. An empty destroyer rode high and rolled far. The remedy was well known and simple: pump seawater into the empty tanks as ballast, and the ship stiffens up again. But ballasting had a cost. Seawater in a fuel tank contaminated it. The tank then had to be pumped, flushed, and cleaned before it could take oil again. And a ship in the middle of ballasting could not simply come alongside a tanker and refuel on short notice. So there was always a pull the other way: hold off, stay ready to fuel, do it later. And over 3 years of war, the decks above had been getting heavier. New radar antennas went up on the masts. More anti-aircraft guns were bolted to the superstructure, with their mounts and their ready service ammunition, because the air threat kept growing and no commander was going to refuse another gun. Weight went on, high up. Very little came off to compensate. So on the morning of the 18th of December, some of those ships met a Typhoon riding light in the tanks and heavy in the tops, with the crews whirled, the racks, the mess, the lockers packed into the ends of a hull that was already asking to roll. They rolled, and some of them did not come back. The other way to die inside a destroyer was faster and left the ship afloat. On the 16th of April, 1945, off Okinawa, the destroyer USS Laffey stood radar picket duty, the loneliest job in the Pacific, a single ship placed out ahead of the fleet specifically so that incoming aircraft would find her first. Over roughly 80 minutes, she was struck again and again by kamikaze aircraft and bombs. Her stern was wrecked, guns were blown off their mounts, fires burned aft, and her steering jammed. She stayed up. Her crew fought her, threw it, and brought her home. And she is still afloat today as a museum ship. 32 of her men were killed. They were not, most of them, killed on the guns. On a ship that small, there is no back of the ship. The compartments where men slept, the mess where they ate, the passageways they queued in, all of it sat inside the same 100 feet of steel that the aircraft were aiming at. A hit anywhere was a hit somewhere. A man off watch might have been lying down. That is what it meant to serve on a destroyer. Not that the work was dangerous. All of it was dangerous. It meant there was no separation at all between the machine and the life. You slept above the magazine because the magazine had to be there. You went thirsty because the boiler could not. Your ship rode high and rolled hard because someone, reasonably, had decided to wait one more day before ballasting. 300 men lived inside a hull that had been built as a weapon first and as a home never, and the compromises that made it a good weapon were paid for a few inches at a time, in the dark, by men lying on canvas over several tons of powder, waiting for the alarm.